Hello, everyone. I'm a long-time listener, first-time storyteller. This takes place in April of 2001. I'd like to read an email that I sent from Greg Richardson, sent Thursday, April 26, 2001 at 3:21 p.m. Subject, priceless. Fresh marlin tacos on the beach, 22 pesos. Ticket from Mazatlan to Nogales, 500 pesos. Vomiting into a paper sack in front of strangers on a foreign bus in a foreign country, priceless. How was the trip to Mazatlan is a question I expect to be asked repeatedly in the next few weeks. To that end, I'd prefer to get this out in a mass email and hopefully avoid putting either of us through the rigors of this story too many times. My favorite / most despised part of the entire trip was a little family-run taqueria on the beach where they sold the world's best fresh marlin tacos. Please note the quotation marks enveloping the word fresh. They were the most wonderfully succulent little nuggets of happiness wrapped up in a homemade flour tortilla that a person could imagine. That was until one wasn't cooked well enough. You've all probably heard the seeming mantra of travelers to and fro our southern neighbors that go something like, "Don't drink the water." Congratulations, folks, for the understatement of the year. To this end, we're still not sure if it was the tacos, the gulps of water of the near tropical Pacific Ocean I gleefully ingested while positioning myself to body surf, the water from the shower that was probably absorbed through the nasty ocean rock cut on my foot, but somehow, some way, some little bacteria or amoeba entered my body. Never in my life have I experienced a body so completely at war with itself. In go half-cup water, out come half-cup water. This in and of itself wasn't too horrible, but for the less squeamish in the audience, there was a fair amount of blood and everything that came back out. Later, I would find out that this nasty little bug had perforated my large intestine and facilitated an infection there. This, combined with the immediate and thorough effects of dehydration in a biological environment that refused all liquid intake and was surrounded by 90 to 100-degree heat, caused me to take serious notice of my condition. That is, to the extent that my mental capacity would allow for such pleasant eccentricities as taking notice of anything. Secondly, our hotel room, without running water, was gaining a certain combination of vilely pungent smells specific only to third world countries where considerable digestive processes have gone awry. Fortunately, my then able-bodied comrade, Marcus, was able to rally and get an ambulance to take me to the emergency room. As liquid and electrolyte intake became possible only through intravenous means, I was set up with an IV and the assistance to my now quadrupled white blood cell was en route. It required the remaining 4 of our 6 days in Mazatlan to get my blood counts back to normal and to get the newly created and discovered hole in my large intestine to repair. All further plans, Puerto Vallarta, parasailing, Cuban cigars, etc., postponed indefinitely. Time to turn tail and make quick egress to our sweet beloved country. Marcus bought a pair of tamales that tasted wonderfully to him as we boarded the bus in Sinaloa. A couple of hours later, it was I that now became the comparative healthy one. Now enter the regurgitation. Poor Marcus began mocking my previous success, or should I say lack thereof, in completing the digestive process. You've never lived until you've sat next to your seemingly only living friend and source of all things translatable, puking into a sack while the natives restlessly shift in their seats. I, who just love to vomit the moment I smell another's, was doing my best to console him and pat him on the back while keeping my shirt balled up in front of my face and nose to ensure that I would forestall catching any wafts of that aroma, which were certain to elicit the same response from me. Imagine a country with no Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. Such would be the makings of a police state wherein an uncoordinated law enforcement brigade would, at the mercy of their own discretion regarding unreasonable search and seizure. Viva Mexico! We got pulled over no less than 6 times in one 45-minute stretch so that all persons, luggage, carry-on, and check-in could be inspected for traveling papers and/or illicit substances. This all the while trying to help the buddy puke accurately and consistently into the sack, keep the shirt over the face, and mentally hold up to the rigors of the 20-hour, 100-degree bus ride. All told, the trip was 11 days, 5 of which were in transit, 6 of which were at Mazatlan. Of the 6 in Mazatlan, 2 were spent recreating and 4 were in the hospital at personal expense to me of $1,200 due to some insurance issues. Currently, Marcus is feeling worlds better and is back to eating like his former hyper-gluttonous self. I've been back in town about 90 minutes now and love this country with previously unforeseen passion. I'm feeling better, but I'm on a strict saltine, cracker, Jell-O, Gatorade medicine diet for the next 6 days. Cost-benefit analysis, I spent a total sum of $2,000 for 2 days on a beach. I now need a vacation worse than I ever have. Really glad to be home. Greg. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jennifer. I have finally succumbed to peer pressure coming up here. Thank you. I guess you don't usually think of that as a good thing, it's worthy of applause. But so I was thinking, actually, you know, as we were sitting here and as you were asking for people to put their name in the hat, I was thinking that I could maybe tell a couple of stories about falling down. From quite a long time ago. And I wanted to describe the first time that I actually fell down in a way that was mortifying was in ballet class. And I was really excited because I got my toe shoes right when I was about to turn 12, you know. So I was 12 years old and I got them, and the first time I was allowed to wear them in class, you know, everything went fine, and we did some very sort of easy things in class, and so I was all fired up. And the second time, we did some harder things in class, but for some reason, the second time, everyone's parents decided to get there early and watch the end of class. So there was this little gaggle of proud people looking in on the class and watching us all do our point work at the end of class. And of course, when there's the crowd there, and I'm feeling very self-conscious at 12 years old, the point work is 10 times harder than the previous class, and I wind up falling over. I fell over because we were supposed to be on one leg, right, with our other leg in the back, I guess, and we were supposed to start out with our foot flat, and then we were supposed to go up on point, and I didn't do it right, so I just went, and the gaggle of parents all together went, "Oh!" like that, and I was not hurt at all. I was mortified, but not hurt. So let's see. I wanted to fast forward to another falling down story. I was in the first musical I was in high school was Fiddler on the Roof, and I later became a performer, so that's sort of an important thing for me, that production of Fiddler on the Roof. And I was just in the chorus, but if you're familiar with the show, there's a character named Fruma-Sarah, and Fruma-Sarah is a ghost. She supposedly comes in somebody's bad dream to haunt them, but it's really just a story. It's a figment of a character's imagination. But anyway, so there was this girl named Fruma-Sarah who I really looked up to because she was a senior, she was very experienced and everything, and she was supposed to ride around, as the ghost, she was supposed to ride around on the shoulders of this guy named Andrew, who was really big and brawny, a football player, apparently. And so, and she had this big long white dress that covered Andrew up all the way, and she was sitting on his shoulders. So she starts, we're doing the play, and she starts coming on stage, and Andrew keeps going and falls off the stage. And landed in the orchestra pit, and the girl who played Fruma-Sarah landed on her feet, and she was fine, except that Andrew was lying on her bedsheet nightgown thing, costume, and so she couldn't move, but she kept going. And she kept singing the song. And so she was a big hero then. A couple of years later, I had been able to get involved in my high school's theater program and had done, you know, some more performances. And we were doing this one sort of showcase performance. And my performance was to sing the song "The Man That Got Away," which you may know is a Judy Garland song, right? And so I was supposed to wear, I was a senior, so I was 17, and I was supposed to wear this like slinky black dress and be all sultry and stuff. And so everything was okay. I got with that, and we came to the show, and I put on my little sulky black or sultry black dress, and I was supposed to at one point go down the stairs off the stage and like flirt with somebody in the front row by like going and sitting on their lap. Okay, this was in the 80s, you know, it was a long time before political correctness, I guess. And so I had character shoes on with a heel like this, and so I was singing, and I was heading toward the stairs, and I was trying to be very elegant, and I took a step off the top step, and all of a sudden I wound up on the bottom step. So it was like I stepped off, and suddenly I'm standing at the bottom. Well, there are 4 steps that go down. And so I don't know how I got from the top step to the bottom step, but it wasn't by walking. And so I just stood there for a minute trying to figure out what just happened. And then I realized that I had tripped down the steps. And I had to then go and find somebody in the front row to sit in their lap. So I was mortified, but I still went and I sat in someone's lap. Last part of it, fast forward a few more years, and I was lucky enough to get cast in a touring production of Nonsense, the musical, when I was 20 years old. And there was a lot of interaction with the audience where you run out into the house and improv with people and come back up. So I would always try to be careful, you know, but there's a lot of stuff going on. So the last time I think I really wiped out big time was I was supposed to go up the stairs onto the stage. I tripped once on the stairs. I tripped a second time just over my costume. And then I tripped a third time by the time I had gotten to center stage, which is where I was supposed to go. But I guess the moral of the story is, and there's a certain movie that was out recently where a key part of it is the character, I don't want to spoil it, where the key part of it at the climax is the character falling down over and over and over again, and then finally getting back up. You might know the scene that I'm talking about in a recent movie. But I think that tripping so much was actually really good for me. That's my story.
There are all kinds of names in here now. So we have enough. Thank you.
Okay. So I grew up in Ohio on a dairy farm. My dad was a dairy farmer. My mother was a school teacher, taught junior high math. And I don't know how many of you know much about dairy farming, but it's pretty intensive. There's a lot to it. And each of us kids had our own chores, you know, that we did on the farm to help out, and as we were old enough to do. But I mean, there are things that are just so intricate, like, well, this specific cow gets 2 extra scoops of grain, and this one gets 1, and this one gets a half, and this one gets 1 1/2, and my dad had all this in his head, exactly what each cow got. And of course, each cow had a name, and he knew everybody's name. I knew some of their names, and people would come over and they'd look at him and they're like, "You can tell them apart?" It's like, yeah. But anyway, so, you know, and of course they had to get a certain amount of feed, and the calves had to get their milk replacer because, of course, their moms were being milked, and so they were getting fed milk replacer. And, you know, different sets of animals got different sets of feed. Anyway, so it's a pretty intricate process. Well, my mother, being a school teacher during the school year, then would have the summers off, and she spent a lot of the time with her roses. She had over 100 rose bushes, and she would try to grow the perfect rose. But she also wanted to take vacation with us kids. So she would convince Dad that we could take a vacation and we were going to go camping. And occasionally it actually worked that way. But of course, Dad, he couldn't just leave. He had to find somebody else that he could train in all the intricacies of, I can't even say it, intricacies of what had to be done, okay? You know, all the little details of everything that had to be done. So I can remember times when we were like all packed. We were all ready to go. Oh no. Margie had a calf and came down with milk fever. Now this cow was worth like $700-800. This was one of his prize cows. And milk fever is right after you have a calf, sometimes they would get sick, okay? And you had to be right on top of it, and you had to get the vet there, and you had to be like giving them antibiotics or whatever to get them out of it. And Dad's like, I can't go anywhere. That's one of my prize cows. I mean, he couldn't go anywhere with any of them got milk fever because cows were worth so much. And farmers didn't make that much. You really had to make every penny count. Well, of course, Mom has 4 kids, and they're all like, we're going camping! And Dad's like, I can't go. And so Mom's like, all right, we're going camping. And I still can't believe she did this, but she would, and you know, we'd have these big canvas tents. I'm sure some of you remember the big heavy canvas tents, and of course sometimes they would leak. And we had the car all packed and we'd take off on a camping trip without Dad, which was a lot harder for her. And I can remember stories, because I was so young that I can't actually remember it in my head, but I remember stories of us going on this camping trip without Dad. And I think it was in Kentucky. And we arrived, and it's pouring rain. And here Mom is with 4 kids, and she's got to put up a tent. And she starts putting up this tent. And all the neighbors come! And it becomes a big party. It's kind of like Floyd if somebody's having trouble. Everybody comes to help out. And we got the tent up. And of course, then it leaked a little bit, but we got the tent up. And we did have a camping trip. And I think one of the things that this brings to mind for me is that you can have a problem out there that looks unsurmountable, but that a lot of times you just need to sit with it for a minute and really think about it. And then we are more capable of dealing with those issues than we ever would have thought we could to begin with.
So I'm not from around here. We're just visiting friends. I'm come all the way here from Charlottesville, but sounded like y'all needed a hand, so I put my name on the list. So far we've heard about, you know, barfing your guts out in a third world country, done that. Visiting a farm and it doesn't work out the way you expect, done that. I thought you needed something a little more exotic. So the trip I'm going to talk about is in Kansas. Okay. So Kansas, we all know about Kansas. Kansas is what stands between Kansas is what stands between Kansas City and Denver. And there's a sign as you pull into the state that says Colorado border, 425 miles. And everybody looks at it and says, that's a threat. Okay, well, I taught at the University of Kansas for 21 years, and the president there decided that since most of us who taught there were not from Kansas, it'd be a good idea to give us an opportunity to go around the state. And what they would do at the end of the spring semester is they'd rent a great big bus, and they'd put a bunch of faculty members and staff, and you actually had to to apply for this. And we would spend literally a week going around the state. I forget what the total mileage was, but it was a lot. Sort of from sun up to sundown. And there's not, it's really a series of kind of vignettes in that. I was trying to, as I was sitting there thinking about it, of what to say. The first one that came to me was, went down to a little town almost to Oklahoma border. I think this was the second day of the trip, and it's called Sedan, Kansas. And it's in the middle of nowhere, and they're trying to, keep the town alive. And so they decided, well, what's the only thing that everybody has heard about Kansas? And I know you're all thinking it, you're embarrassed to say about it, but the Wizard of Oz. So Sedan, Kansas raised some money, and they made a little, of course, yellow brick road down the middle of the town. And to raise the money, of course, they told people, well, we'll inscribe your name on the yellow brick road. So we're walking along the yellow brick road, and somebody says, hey, there's the governor and his wife. Their names are inscribed. Except there was a little problem. The governor and his wife were no longer married. And furthermore, the ex-wife was a faculty member at the University of Kansas. Fortunately, she was not on the trip. But the next time somebody does, well, I'm not questioning any of your relationships, but the next time you think about having one of these memorial bricks inscribed, maybe your mother or father who's passed on or whatever. We visited a bunch of other places. Again, there's a lot more to Kansas than people give it credit to. We visited Clay City, Kansas, which has, supposedly, the world's largest ball of twine. Now, I've subsequently learned there's about at least a half a dozen, and it's probably more like 20 or 30 places that claim to have the world's largest ball of twine. They did have a rather large ball of twine. We visited Greenburg, Kansas, which you might have heard it got pretty much wiped out by a tornado. It was probably about 10 years ago and was rebuilt, fortunately. But what we visited was the world's deepest hand-dug well. And guess what? It survived the tornado quite well. We visited a bunch of just kind of, Kansas-y type things. The one that particularly now sticks into my head, the southwestern Kansas is a large meatpacking area. And as a lot of you may know, meatpacking is absolutely the worst job in the world. And I mean that quite seriously. So that's where immigrants go. And we visited this little, it wasn't a little school, it was actually a pretty big school. And they had something like 37 nationalities there. And they were refugees for the most part. Again, you don't take meatpacking jobs unless you're don't have a lot of options. And it was some sort of day, they had some Laotian refugees, sort of this was a number of years ago. They were still, fleeing the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And it was some national day. And these people, dirt poor, I'm sure, had managed to recreate the native costumes. And these young girls, they were probably 10, 12, were dancing these native costumes and so forth. It was just, it brought tears to your eyes, as well it should. The two other little things, we finished up with actually I'm only remembering one. We finished up at a ranch in the middle of what's called the Flint Hills. Flint Hills are a little south of I-70 where you're driving along. It's this vast area that was never farmed because it's these hills and there's rock too close to the surface. A very generous alum was hosting us there, and he owned something that was probably literally about the size of Luxembourg. And he had this ranch house in the middle of a high hill. There are hills in Kansas, and binoculars, and even with the binoculars, you couldn't even see to the end. But we're far from the city lights, and we get back on our bus, and it's a full moon, or I guess the moon must have risen, because at first, it's stars like you've never seen. I mean, it's these just black sky with these little dots, and then the moon starts rising. And one of the people along with us was an African-American woman she was an administrator who sang gospel in her church. And she started, I don't even remember the song, but singing this gospel song. And it's this magical moment. And I look into the sky, and there's these little dots, of course, going across jet planes. And I'm thinking, those people up there, this is just flyover country.
So the last time I did this, I did it with notes, so this will be my second time. So who knows what's going to happen? You know, being in my 40s, my mid-40s, I'm thinking back as to what sort of trips I've taken and the interesting ones, and there's been a ton. I was in the Navy for 6 years, and I was in the U.S. Geological Survey. And I think the last time you heard from me, I was talking about canoes. And I don't want to typecast myself. I've got some great canoe trip stories to talk about, but we'll leave those rest. So we're going to the Navy, and the very first time I ever went to sea, like the ocean for real. Now, to go back a little bit, why did I go into the Navy? Well, I had a year of college, actually, at Virginia Tech. It's little known, I was in the Corps of Cadets. So friends of mine, it's interesting that I've come back to Virginia Tech area after all these years. But I love the Corps of Cadets, and I love the military. My dad had worked, you know, in the Northern Virginia area around the Pentagon, and he was Department of the Navy. So I kind of knew I wanted to go into military service, or at least I think I know, because, you know, when you're like 17 or 18, you think you know what your life is going to be about, and you usually don't have a clue about what you're really good at. So, you know, it probably should have come to me at some point that I should see whether I was actually good at sea. I had never been out to sea before. I was not a sailor, and this is true for a lot of Navy enlisted personnel. And so I was very excited. I'd actually been in the Navy for 2 years already, just going through the nuclear power training program. And when I was at my final station for nuclear power training, you go through the prototype, land-based prototype training. I was up in Ballston Spa, New York, where they have some training reactors and facilities. And the list of where people are going to go came out. And we're all really excited. This is where you're going to be for the next 3 or 4 years in the Navy. And there was an aircraft carrier manning up, the USS Stennis, I remember, and it's a massive aircraft carrier, and it just sucks personnel into it when they get these aircraft carriers started. And everybody was afraid. They're like, we're going to be in the surface fleet forever. I really wanted to go into submarines. I thought, you know, that's cool. So I'd asked for submarine service, which is all volunteer, of course. And the list came out, and my name wasn't there. Then an updated list came out, and my name wasn't there. And all these people going to the Stennis, and oh man, I'm going to the Stennis. I'll be on an aircraft carrier for the rest of my life. Some people were like, woo, I'm going to, you know, a submarine in California or wherever. And finally a list came out, and there was my name. And I remember one of the senior personnel was with me, and he said, I was like, what is the NR1? What is the NR1? And NR1 is actually, it took me a while to figure out, because it wasn't the name of a U.S. warship. And I said, he's like, the NR1 is like an elite deep diving nuclear powered submarine. It's the only one of its kind in the world. And I said, and they were like, we don't know how you got there, because you have to be the best of the best to be on the NR1. It is literally a small, they called it Admiral Rickover's most expensive toy, because he basically built this, I want to say it was like 100 feet long, which is pretty small, and it had this nuclear reactor that was the size of a trash can, literally. The core, the reactor core, was the size of a trash can. And he put this together, and back in the late 60s. I heard the late 60s before, so there's a lot going on back then. And so it was a pretty old submarine, but it was still this elite thing, and I was going to it. And I was like, okay, I didn't know what that meant. Well, what it actually meant was, because I was brand new, that there are only 12 people that go out on the NR1 submarine. when it goes underway, because it's so small that only 12 people can actually be on that vessel. Maybe a couple extra, but it gets really tight really fast. And I was part of the support crew. Oh man, that's a bummer because I've just started. So I was part of the support crew. Well, the support crew is there to help essentially the main crew take care of the ship until it goes underway. But we also go out on the tow ship because it's a small boat. It doesn't have a lot of power, and it's designed to go deep. It can do 5 knots maximum. 5 nautical miles per hour isn't very fast if you know what a knot is. And so it has to be towed to its location that it's going. So we get to go out on the tow ship, and that was the first time I went out and see, and I was very excited. And the doctor, the Navy doctor, came in and was like, we have these meclizine patches, which is kind of like Dramamine or another, and you need to wear these meclizine patches if you're not sure if you get seasick. And I'm like, okay, I'll do it. And he's like, well, a side effect is you get really drowsy. So I'm like, okay. So I take the meclizine patch at the appropriate time. I know I'm going out to sea. Seas might be rough. But I'm like, I don't want to get drowsy. So I drink a ton of coffee. Well, the ton of coffee doesn't make you drowsy. It stimulates you, and it pretty much counteracts the effects of the meclizine. So I go out there, and a squall comes in. And it is, the divers out on the NR1, they got the screw kind of caught up in some lobster traps. They're literally, the divers themselves are puking from like motion sickness because the seas are that rough. And I remember this Zodiac boat, or Z-boat as they call them, like coming over to the support ship that we were on, which was a civilian tow ship, and like trying to get onto the boat, and it's just like that, right? You know, if you've ever been in high seas and tried to go from one boat to another, like you could die. That's a real possibility. And you know, I was like, wow, I'm among real sailors, and I'm also about to puke. And anyhow, the end of the story is it was an amazing trip, and I could go into tons of details. Given more time, sea stories just tend to go on and on and on. So I don't want anybody to have to feign death here to get me to stop talking. But seriously, I eventually was told to go to the rack. And the one great thing, if you're ever seasick, is you just go vertical or go horizontal in your rack, and you go to sleep, and everything's beautiful. And I remember they're like, it was just a day trip. Basically, we were going out for 24 hours to test some equipment, and they come back to they're like, hey, Simpson, it's time to get up. And they're shaking me, and I'm like, what? Where are we? And I get up, and it's a beautiful sunny day, and we're coming back up the Thames River, actually pronounced Thames, but spelt like the Thames, and we're coming up the Thames River in Connecticut, and it was just beautiful, and I still felt a little queasy, but I'm like, wow, this is incredible. And also, all these sailors did all this work while I was basically in the rack because I wasn't functioning whatsoever. And I went, I got back in they're like, okay, you're done for the day. You're useless. Go home. And I lived up in a town nearby, and got in my car and was immediately motion sick driving because I still had that in me. But that was my first time ever at sea. And next time, maybe I'll tell you a story about a real submarine trip.
All right, so this is my second time here, and I'm excited to share this story. Just like Alan, I'm going to talk about my family's like me and my family going on a cruise for the first time. And it was an interesting experience. So just a little bit backstory. I was born in India, and my family and I moved here in 2008. For the, we moved with about like $2,000 total. And so like it took us a couple years to kind of, kind kind of get used to the here, like get used to United States and make some money. And then 2012 was the first time we took a like a family trip, and that was our first trip in the United States. It was during July, and we decided to just go on a cruise for the first time. And I remember, like I was super excited. So I did this whole, like I was the one who planned it. I planned over, bought plane tickets. I talked to the people, got our cruise tickets and all that stuff. And, just, we kind of knew from my aunt telling us that you probably want to get there to like a day early, just to be on a safer side, because the plane, the planes can be delayed, and you may miss your cruise. And so we decided to, so we lived in New Jersey, and then the cruise was going from Miami, and so we decided to go a day early, fly down to Miami, and we got there pretty early, around like 10 o'clock in the morning, 9 or 10 o'clock, and our hotel check-in wasn't until 3 o'clock. So what we had done is we had rented a van for the day, and it was my family as well as my uncle's, and one of my uncle's family, and we decided to get the van and went to the hotel to drop off our luggage, but they said that they didn't have any space, and so we couldn't put our luggage. But we had a couple of hours, so we went to a nearby mall in Miami just to have lunch and spend some time before our check-in time. And we had parked the van. It was like a 15-passenger van, and we had parked it, and we went inside. We had lunch, and we were all excited to spend the rest of the day in Miami and go to the South Beach. And so we came back out about like an hour and a half later, and we saw our car was broken into, and we found out. So there was a mall security there, so we talked to the guy, and then we called the cops. And it was about, I think it was like 100 degrees that day, and it took 2 hours for a cop to get there. We called a couple of times trying to figure out where the cop was, and we couldn't leave, and we all just sat there in the mall parking lot on a sidewalk, and then the cop came and did the whole report, and we found out that this is also for anyone trying to go to Florida in future. If you go to Florida and you rent a van, make sure you don't have any luggage in your car, because this is very common where the people would go to mall parking lots, and then they will see any big passenger van, and they will assume that there's a luggage in there, so they'll break into your car and steal it. So we had a bunch of our small bags, but we also had book bags and stuff, and they tend to steal smaller items just because it's easier for them to take it with them. And so they stole about 4 book bags, and they didn't steal one important thing, which was sitting on the passenger side of the chair, the seat, just on top. It was nothing covering it, and had all of our passports and green cards in it. And so at the time we weren't citizens, so we had our green cards and the passport, and we're going to Cozumel in Mexico, which is in Mexico, so we had to have our green cards. And so we were super lucky, because we wouldn't have been able to go on a cruise. But we got, that's something that they didn't take, luckily, and nothing important, other than I think one of the bag had a camera in it. But we got insurance money from insurance, and we didn't have to pay anything for broken glass of the rental car. But we were super exhausted. By the time this whole thing was done, it was 6 o'clock, and we didn't get to go to South Beach. We just went to the hotel, just rested for the next day, and then went on the cruise. But we got to see South Beach as our cruise ship was leaving the port, which was the only time. I think that's the only time we've been to Florida. But this summer, I'm from Virginia Tech, and this summer I have an internship in Florida, so I'll be pretty close. I'll be in St. Petersburg, but I'll try to go to South Beach, and hopefully this time my car doesn't get broken into. But